By the end of that afternoon, the crowd already knew who had lost. Not because anyone had been struck. Not because voices were raised, or blood was drawn. Witnesses would later say the taller man never understood when it happened, only that, at some point, the ground beneath his certainty quietly disappeared. And standing across from him, calm and unchanged, was Bruce Lee. What followed was not a fight. It was something far more difficult to explain, and impossible to forget. The room was not chosen for drama. It was chosen because it existed. A rectangular training hall, wooden floor worn smooth by years of footwork, mirrors along one wall that reflected posture more than ego. The air carried the quiet residue of sweat and resin, the kind that settles into places where movement is practiced daily, not celebrated. There were no banners, no elevated platform, no separation between observer and participant. People drifted in without ceremony. Some were students. Some were instructors from neighboring schools. A few were simply curious. Word had traveled in the way it always does, without invitation, without urgency. A challenge had been spoken aloud somewhere else, and now it had found a room. The rules were never written. That was the first thing witnesses would later agree on. No gloves were laid out. No timekeeper stepped forward. No referee marked boundaries. Whatever was about to happen would be governed not by sport, but by understanding. Or the lack of it. In one corner of the room stood a man whose presence did not immediately reorganize the space. He warmed his hands slowly, rolled his shoulders once, then stopped moving altogether. He did not test the floor. He did not scan the crowd. His posture suggested readiness without anticipation, as if the moment were already familiar to him. Across from where the crowd naturally gathered was empty space, intentionally so. That space invited projection. It allowed size, reputation, and expectation to arrive before the person who would eventually fill it. Observers later said this imbalance was obvious from the start. Not in physical terms, but in how attention behaved. Conversations tilted in one direction. Glances lingered where they expected weight, height, and noise to appear. The room itself seemed to lean. Someone asked, quietly, whether this was a demonstration or a test. No one answered. That silence was not accidental. It established the true conditions of the encounter. There would be no explanation afterward that relied on misunderstanding. Whatever unfolded would stand on what was seen, and what could not be easily explained. The man waiting did not object to the lack of structure. He did not request clarification. Those close enough noticed something subtle. He positioned himself neither at the center nor against the wall, but just off the line where people naturally focused. It was a placement that reduced spectacle without avoiding engagement. This was not humility performed for an audience. It was economy. Witnesses would later say that, in that moment, the outcome was already constrained. Not decided, but limited. The room had rules now, even if no one had spoken them aloud. They were rules of balance, of distance, of timing. Rules that favored understanding over assertion. And when the sound of heavier footsteps finally approached the doorway, the room did not react the way it expected to. It grew quieter. The man who entered did not rush. His height announced itself first, then his shoulders, then the certainty with which he occupied space. He was tall enough that the doorway briefly framed him like a measurement, not a person. To some in the room, that alone felt like proof. Size has a way of settling arguments before they begin. He did not bow. He did not scan for permission. His presence rearranged attention the way loud objects always do, by force of contrast. Conversations stopped not because they were interrupted, but because they no longer mattered. Those who had heard of him before recognized the posture. Not aggressive, not careless, assured. He had been challenged before, and each time the outcome had reinforced the same lesson. Reach decides range, mass decides outcome. The body becomes its own argument. He stood near the center without being invited there. Someone near the mirrors shifted their stance, unconsciously giving ground. Another folded their arms, as if bracing for something that had not yet taken shape. The crowd's expectations were not malicious, but they were heavy. Many assumed they were about to witness a correction, of reputation, of myth, of imbalance. The larger man spoke, but not loudly. It was not a threat. It was closer to a declaration. A statement meant to be heard by everyone without needing repetition. He questioned method, questioned practicality, questioned whether skill without size could survive contact with reality. He did not mention names. He did not need to. His words were not aimed at the man standing quietly off-center. They were aimed at the idea that had gathered around him. The idea that efficiency could outweigh force. That control could exist without dominance. This was not a challenge of violence. It was a challenge of visibility. Witnesses would later describe how the room subtly aligned itself with the larger figure, not in loyalty, but in habit. People are trained to trust what looks convincing. Height convinces. Confidence convinces. Stillness, when misunderstood, can look like absence. The smaller man did not interrupt. He did not counter with explanation. He did not reposition himself to reclaim attention. He simply remained where he was, hands relaxed, eyes present but unprovocative. Those closest to him noticed that his breathing did not change. The larger man, by contrast, began to move more. A shift of weight. A roll of the neck. A casual flexing of the hands. Not preparation for attack, preparation for being watched. His body asked the room to recognize what it already believed. The imbalance was now complete. One man had the crowd. The other had the space between them. And in that space, though few realized it yet, the outcome was already narrowing. No signal was given. There was no clap of hands, no verbal confirmation, no countdown. What passed for agreement happened without witnesses noticing the moment it occurred. At some point, both men simply stood facing one another with the same understanding. Nothing else needed to be said. The larger man assumed this meant permission. He took a half-step forward, not aggressive, not rushed. It was the kind of movement used to test reaction, to see whether presence alone would force adjustment. In most rooms, it did. People either backed away or stiffened, revealing intent before action. Nothing happened. The smaller man did not retreat. He did not square up. He did not raise his hands into a recognizable guard. His posture remained neutral, almost informal, as if the exchange had not yet officially begun. This unsettled some of the observers. One instructor near the wall later recalled thinking the moment had stalled. That perhaps courtesy or uncertainty was delaying things. Another assumed restraint, that the smaller man was waiting to be attacked first, bound by some internal rule. What they did not see was that the engagement had already started. Distance was being measured. Weight distribution was being read. Timing was being tested without motion. The larger man shifted again, this time angling his body slightly, presenting his shoulder. It was a subtle invitation to escalation, a way of saying, "This is real now." His eyes searched for a response, any sign that the other man had registered the change. Still nothing. Silence has a way of magnifying expectation. The room leaned forward without moving. Breath became audible in places. Someone in the back adjusted their footing, the sound of rubber against wood briefly louder than it should have been. The larger man smiled, briefly. Not mockery. Confidence. He spoke again, quieter this time, as if narrowing his audience to the person in front of him. Witnesses could not later agree on the exact words, only the intent. It was an invitation framed as inevitability, a suggestion that resistance would only delay the obvious. The response, when it came, was not verbal. The smaller man adjusted his stance by inches. Not backward. Not forward. Slightly off the line that connected them. It was a movement so economical that several people missed it entirely. Those who noticed could not explain why it mattered, only that it changed how the space felt. The larger man paused. It was brief but real. In that pause, something shifted in the room. Not fear. Not excitement. Awareness. The sense that whatever was about to happen would not follow familiar patterns. There was still time to stop. No one did. And without any signal that observers could later point to, the demonstration began, quietly, decisively, and in a way that left most of the room unsure whether they had seen anything at all. To those watching closely, it looked like nothing happened. There was no sudden clash. No sharp intake of breath from the crowd. No sound that marked a beginning. The larger man moved first, But even that movement did not resemble attack. It was a reach, measured, confident, meant to establish contact and, with it, control. His hand did not land where he expected. Not because it was blocked. Not because it was struck aside. It simply found less than it reached for. The smaller man had not stepped away. He had not evaded in the way people recognize as defense. Instead, the line between them had shifted. The angle changed just enough that reach no longer meant access. To an untrained eye, the distance looked the same. To the body, it was not. The larger man adjusted immediately. Another reach, this time with more commitment. His weight followed the way it always had. 4 years, this had been enough. Weight closes gaps. Weight decides outcomes. Again, nothing dramatic occurred. No throw. No visible lock. No strike. Yet the larger man's balance hesitated. Only for a fraction of a second, but long enough. Those nearest the exchange noticed something difficult to articulate. The taller man was still standing, still strong, still unhurt. And yet, his movement had lost continuity. Each action now arrived slightly late, as if responding to a decision already made elsewhere. The smaller man remained quiet. His hands did not flash. His expression did not change. He did not pursue advantage. He allowed the moment to exist exactly as it was. This was the part most people missed. They expected resolution through impact. Instead, what unfolded was subtraction. Options quietly disappeared. The larger man found that advancing did not produce pressure, and retreating did not restore control. The space between them no longer behaved predictably. He tried once more, this time faster. It was the only moment that produced a sound, the brief scuff of a shoe correcting itself against the floor. That sound mattered. It was proof that effort had been spent without result. The larger man stopped moving. He had not been thrown. He had not been struck. But something fundamental had been demonstrated to him, privately, in front of everyone. Those who understood mechanics would later say that structure had been taken without force. Timing had been answered before it was asked. Balance had been borrowed and returned, changed. The rest of the room only sensed the aftermath. The tension did not release. It collapsed inward. And for the first time since he entered, the larger man looked directly at the person in front of him, not as an idea to be tested, but as a problem he did not yet have language for. That was when the silence grew heavier than the crowd had expected. The larger man did not step back immediately. He stood where he was, feet planted, arms loose at his sides. To anyone unfamiliar with confrontation, it might have looked like composure. To those who had spent years in training halls, it looked like recalibration under pressure. He tested his weight again, subtly. Shifted from heel to ball. The floor responded normally. His body did not. There was no pain, no weakness, but a growing uncertainty about sequence, about what would happen after he moved. That uncertainty mattered. He raised one hand, not to strike, but to confirm distance. It hovered, then lowered. The space between them felt unreliable now. What had moments earlier seemed straightforward, reach, contact, dominate, no longer aligned with what his body was reporting back to him. The smaller man did not capitalize on this. He did not advance. He did not correct. He did not instruct. He waited. That waiting did something more damaging than resistance. It forced the larger man to confront the absence of opposition as a condition he could not solve. There was no force to overcome, no obstacle to overpower. Only a quiet refusal to participate in familiar patterns. A few in the crowd shifted their attention. Not toward the smaller man, but toward the larger one. They began to watch him instead. His posture. His hesitation. The minute delays between intention and action. This change in focus was not kind. The larger man sensed it. His shoulders tightened slightly, not with anger, but with the pressure of visibility. Confidence, once displayed, now required maintenance. And maintenance demanded action. He took a step forward. It was not reckless. It was controlled. But it was heavier than before, carrying with it the expectation that commitment itself would restore order. The step did not land cleanly. Nothing dramatic occurred, no stumble, no loss of footing. Yet the movement ended without advantage. The smaller man was no closer, no more threatened, no more impressed. The action had consumed effort and returned nothing. The larger man exhaled sharply. Witnesses later described that moment as the turning point, not because of what happened, but because of what didn't. There was no escalation, no correction from the smaller man, no sign that he intended to finish anything. The implication was unmistakable. If harm had been the goal, it would already have occurred. Understanding arrived slowly, and when it did, it brought something heavier than embarrassment. It brought clarity. The realization that strength, here, was irrelevant. That size had not been defeated, it had been excluded. The larger man nodded once. It was not a gesture of surrender in the traditional sense. It was acknowledgement, the kind given when an argument has ended without words. He stepped back, creating distance for the first time since entering the room. The smaller man remained still. No bow was exchanged. No statement offered. The demonstration ended the same way it had begun, without announcement. But the room had changed. The crowd did not applaud. They did not need to. Something had been resolved, and everyone present understood that it could not be undone. Only later would they struggle to explain why. The room returned to its ordinary use within hours. Students resumed training. Conversations shifted to other subjects. The floor absorbed new scuffs, new sounds, new repetitions. Nothing about the space itself marked what had occurred there. There was no plaque, no photograph, no written account pinned to a wall. Yet those who had been present carried something with them. The story did not spread quickly. It moved the way accurate things often do, through careful retelling, usually when someone questioned whether efficiency could truly outweigh force. The details varied. The height of the challenger changed. The wording of the challenge softened or sharpened depending on who remembered it. But the core remained intact. No punches were thrown. No one was hurt. No doubt remained. Years later, when the name Bruce Lee surfaced in discussions of method rather than myth, this incident was rarely described outright. It was referenced indirectly. There was a time, someone would say, when a much larger man tested him. And that was usually enough. The larger man did not vanish from his own discipline. He continued teaching, continued training. Those who encountered him afterward noticed a difference, not in his strength, but in his emphasis. He spoke less about dominance, more about position, less about imposing will, more about understanding consequence. He never framed it as a loss. He didn't need to. For those who witnessed the exchange, the lesson was not about victory. It was about restraint, about the quiet confidence that comes from knowing when action is unnecessary, about the discipline required to demonstrate truth without humiliating the person who came to challenge it. In later years, students would ask why no techniques were demonstrated that day, why nothing spectacular had occurred. The answer, when it came, was always indirect. Because what was shown did not require memory of movement, only memory of realization. The incident became a reference point, not a headline. A reminder that mastery does not announce itself, and that the most decisive moments often look uneventful to those waiting for noise. What endured was not the image of a giant humbled, but of a moment where force was invited and declined. And in that refusal, something lasting took shape. Not a victory to be celebrated, a standard to be measured against. The kind that remains long after the room has emptied, and the floor has forgotten the sound of footsteps.